Good morning. My name is Jennifer Fitchett, and I'm an Associate Professor of Physical Geography at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa. I also serve as the African Counselor of the International Society of Biometeorology and as the President-elect of the Society of South African Geographers. I'm very excited to have been given this opportunity by Africa in Science to present one of these lectures in their lecture series. Today I'm going to be talking about biometeorological research in Africa. I'm going to be focusing on a paper that I published earlier this year in the International Journal of Biometeorology, presenting a review of all of the work that's been done of and in African countries in the International Journal of Biometeorology since its inception in 1957. Now, to begin with, you might be wondering what biometeorology is. Biometeorology is a subdiscipline of applied climatology, looking specifically at the impact of climate change on plants, animals, and people. It includes a number of sub-themes, including phenology, climate change and health, the impacts of climate change on tourism, and thermal comfort and stress. It also focuses on animal biometeorology and agricultural biometeorology, among a few other smaller sub-themes. At the event of the 60th anniversary of the International Society of Biometeorology in 2017, a special issue was published in the International Journal of Biometeorology that included a number of reviews on the state of biometeorology amongst specific subdisciplines, such as phenology, tourism climatology, and climate and human health. And these provided really good insight into the work that's being done regionally and across different sub-themes within each of these key areas of biometeorological research. In this special issue was a paper exploring the last 60 years of the International Journal of Biometeorology, written by Scott Sheridan and Michael Allen. In this paper, they demonstrate the country of origin of lead authors and of reviewers. And none of the African countries form part of this top 10 group of either authors or reviewers. And indeed, the entire African continent therefore sits in this category of the rest of the world. And so it was with that background that I was approached to look into the work that had been done in the African continent, the proportion of work that that represented, and the key themes and countries of study that were represented amongst this work. And so this led to this paper, The Perspectives of Biometeorological Research on the African Continent. I look over the period of 1957 to 2020 at the work that has been published in the journal broadly, over 4,000 papers, and the work specifically that had been conducted in and of Africa, which represented only 135 papers. This is a very small proportion, about 3.5% of all of the work that has been published in the journal. And so for the rest of this talk, I'm going to be looking at what work has been done, why it's important to do more biometeorological research in Africa, and how we might encourage this to be done. So let's start with talking about why we want to do research on biometeorology in Africa. And I would argue that in addition to better representation and more equal representation of the African continent relative to continental regions such as North America and Europe, that Africa actually represents one of the most exciting places to be doing biometeorological research, and indeed one of the settings which most urgently requires research from a biometeorological standpoint. Africa is already and projected to continue to experience temperature increases that are in excess of the global mean. The African continent and African countries have heightened vulnerability to this climate change, as many of them are economically developing regions and have to make very difficult cost-benefit analyses in terms of investing in future climate change and impacts that are likely to affect the region in decades to come, while also meeting very basic human rights needs of their populations, many of which require very costly infrastructural investments, such as the provision of electricity, water, shelter, and health. The African continent also has a very widespread incidence of climate-sensitive diseases, such as malaria, cholera, Ebola, as well as the more common seasonal flus and colds. The African continent and African countries have a very heavy reliance on local and subsistence agriculture for very basic survival in terms of food security, but then as we move into more commercial agriculture in terms of major exports, particularly to regions such as Europe and North America. And in terms of tourism, many areas of the African continent have very diverse wildlife, have incredible scenery, and have some of the best beaches and weather for tourism. And so many areas in Africa have developed very, very strong and successful tourism attractions and tourism sectors, which provide to the GDP of those countries. And under climate change, those tourism destinations are under threat. So as a result of these key points, each of the very important themes within biometeorology have a very good laboratory in a very natural setting in the African continent. But it's also clearly a region which would really benefit from a stronger understanding of the impact of climate change on plants, animals, and humans. And so it's really an important place to be diverting even greater focus than the international mean. And indeed, we need to improve the focus that we currently have. So towards this, the paper in question was a review paper, and it followed a roughly Prisma style approach in reviewing the papers on and of Africa in the International Journal of Biometeorology. It was restricted to papers in the International Journal of Biometeorology to allow for comparison to previous international studies, such as that by Sheridan and Allen. Of course, there are papers that have covered themes in biometeorology from Africa published in other related journals, such as Theoretical and Applied Climatology, the Journal of Mountain Science, Progress in Physical Geography, and Agricultural and Forest Meteorology. So there are a number of other journals which we do acknowledge are encompassing work on Africa and in the fields of biometeorology. But for the purpose of this review, those are excluded for comparability. The review paper followed the methodology of previous reviews, again, in the interest of being able to compare the findings, particularly those reviews in the 60th anniversary special issue. Search operations were conducted on all issues of the journal since 1957, leading up to and including the 12th of June 2020, and including all of the early online papers that were captured on the journal's webpage up until the 12th of June 2020. And so as you'll see on the right-hand side, this went through a process of identification, screening, eligibility, and inclusion. And in this process, a number of papers were excluded from the final sample, and I'll reflect back on those later in this talk. So a final sample of 135 papers were identified to be deliberately studying the biometeorology of or in an African country. So this 135 papers is 135 of a total of 4,014 papers that were published as research papers in the International Journal of Biometeorology. That represents across this full period 3.4% of all papers in the journal. It averaged over 1957 to 2020 of 2 papers per year. And over the first 5 decades, the average was only 1 paper per year that focused on the African continent. The largest annual total was 15 papers in 2018, but that was concurrent with the greatest total number of papers published in the journal in a year that had really bumper issues with a number of special issues and a large number of papers per issue of the journal. There were also numerous years in which there was no content from the African continent at all. This interannual variability is captured in the graph in front of you now, and you really can see these periods where there was no content from Africa, particularly in the earlier half of the operations of the journal. The increase that we see from 2011 onwards is really promising, although the low numbers in 2019 and 2020 are of concern in the upkeep of a trend towards increased participation in research on and of Africa. But when we look at these trends, we need to see them in terms of the overall trends of the journal. And so I've represented that graph to you with Sheridan and Allen's 2017 graph, demonstrating the trends for the journal as a whole. And you can see that very closely, the peaks in numbers of papers on African biometeorology match the trends and the peaks in the total number of papers of the journal. And so roughly this 3.4% maintains throughout the years of study. The large increase aligned with the shift to editorial manager that took place in 2006, which allowed for much easier handling of large numbers of papers coming in from across the world and the publication of greater numbers of papers in total. In 2004, which was the peak for the journal as a whole, African papers did represent a slightly large proportion at 3.9%, but remained lower than 4% of the total number of papers, and significantly lower than approximately 20%, which would represent amongst the major continents the proportion we would hope to see from the African continent. If we now look into these 135 papers and the work that has been done, we can see that a very large focus has been placed on animal biometeorology, with over half of the papers from the African continent focusing on this subtheme. This is not surprising because in Africa, we have very, very large reliance on livestock, and we have a very exciting area to be exploring issues in terms of heat and animals. And so this is certainly an important area of research in the African continent and something that should continue in future. This is followed by studies on thermal comfort and stress, human health, phenology, plant productivity and distribution, and then much smaller numbers of studies on climate, urban and building, insects, birds, tourism and leisure, aerobiology, amphibians, and fish. Now, depending on your definition of animal biometeorology, some of these topics might be included in the total for animal biometeorology, such as insects, birds, amphibians, and fish, which would increase that proportion even further. If we look at where studies have been done, the majority of studies on African biometeorology have been conducted in Nigeria at 36 of the 135 studies, followed by South Africa, Ghana, Algeria, and Morocco. For 11 countries, only one study was conducted. And there are regions for which no studies have yet been conducted, countries such as Lesotho and Eswatini, among others. So who are writing these papers on and of African biometeorology? Really interesting when we start to look at this distribution. So if we look at a map of the world and the authorship, a lot of studies are being conducted internationally. There are studies being conducted on African biometeorology from researchers in South America, North America, Europe, Eurasia, Australia. And if we look in at the African continent, there are a number of African countries which are not represented in the authorship at all. The number of studies that have one author from the country studied, 63% do. Further 65% have at least one author from Africa who is not necessarily from the country studied. Only 44% have all of the authors from the country studied, and only 45.2% have all of the authors from Africa. And so among the small 3.4% of papers in the journal that are on or of African biometeorology, an even smaller percent are authored by people within that African country or in the African continent as a whole. And so we certainly need to start working towards greater visibility of African biometeorologists working in and on Africa. There are some interesting trends in terms of the number of authors, although many of these match broader trends across the sciences and certainly across biometeorology from different regions of the world. In the early 1950s, 1960s, the number of authors were really low, with a maximum number of authors of 1 or 2 and an average number of authors of around 1 to 1.3. A big shift happens in the 2000s, where the average number of authors jumps up to 29 in the 2000s and 4.2 in the 2010s, and with maximum numbers of authors of 13 in the 2010s and 5 in the 2000s. So we're moving from 1 to 2.9 to 4.2. We're seeing much greater numbers of authors, and that, of course, is facilitated by the advance of technologies such as Skype, such as email, which allow for much greater international and multi-person collaborations at much lower cost. I then want to briefly touch on the excluded material. If you looked at my Prisma style flowchart right at the beginning of the methods, you'd see that a number of papers had been eliminated at various stages. So initially, using Africa and each of the names, current and previous, of African countries, a total of 372 papers were identified by the Springer Link search of the International Journal of Biometeorology. And of those, 237 were deleted because they did not actually study the biometeorology of an African country. But it's important to see what they did study. because it demonstrates an engagement with Africa, with African countries, and with biometeorological research that is interested in African countries. So these papers, the 237 that were eliminated, came up in the search because either they mentioned an African country or prior research in an African country in the introduction or perhaps the discussion section of the papers, because they were authored by African researchers but explored the biometeorology of countries outside of Africa, such as countries in the Middle East, countries such as Iran. And thirdly, because they were theoretical or review papers that mentioned African studies, but were not actually empirically studying the African continent. And all three of these categories are really important. In the first category, studies that are engaging with research being done on the African continent are really, really important in us getting an understanding of the importance of African biometeorology, but also in highlighting and creating visibility for studies of and on African biometeorology. Papers that were authored by African biometeorologists and exploring countries outside of Africa are really exciting because we saw how many of the studies and what a large footprint there was internationally in terms of the studies being conducted on Africa. And so it's useful to reverse this kind of research imperialism, as some people refer to it as, and have African researchers studying outside countries. This is really important, again, in being able to facilitate international collaborations and being able to demonstrate the importance of African biometeorologists in contributing to a global science. And so although they're not included in this paper, these are really important contributions. And then, of course, theoretical and review papers, while they're not empirically studying a particular biometeorological question in or on Africa, it's really useful to see those engaging with literature from Africa or considering Africa in a theoretical light. And so again, these are important to keep an eye on and to follow up on in terms of future research that's taking place. But at 3.4% of the total number of papers in the International Journal of Biometeorology, we certainly need to encourage greater engagement from the African continent and of the African continent in the international biometeorological space. A really important move towards this was the inclusion of regional councillors on the International Society of Biometeorology Executive. This is critical in being able to heighten the voice of African biometeorology and to be able to encourage people to join the society and publish in the journal. A second important move was the inclusion of special sessions in the International Congress of Biometeorology meetings to allow for a very dedicated and deliberate move to showcasing the voices of African biometeorologists and showcasing the work that they're being done. And there was one such session held in the 2021 International Society of Biometeorology Congress that took place online. A third area would be the inclusion of special issues in the journal on research from Africa. But of course, this requires research to be conducted such that we could fill a special issue. Related to that then, is a greater outreach to African scholars who might unknowingly be working on topics of biometeorology. Biometeorology is so exciting because it is interdisciplinary and because it draws from so many different fields that are already existing. And so it is very possible that there are a number of people who might be working in the health sciences with an interest on climate change, who might be working in agricultural science with an interest in climate change, who might be working as tourism specialists but have an interest on what's happening in terms of climate change. And they might all be doing biometeorological research without being aware of this umbrella term, the society and the journal. And so part of being able to fill a special issue or to encourage people to attend a special session of a meeting is identifying those pieces of work and those researchers who perhaps don't know that they fall under the umbrella of biometeorology and encouraging them to submit to the journal. Another way of doing this is through the inclusion of more African scholars in editorial boards and as reviewers. And again, that comes to identifying people who are already working in that field and who might be very well positioned to serve as a reviewer, and having completed sufficient number of high quality reviews, inviting them to join the editorial board of the journal. And again, the International Journal of Biometeorology has been making a very deliberate effort towards increasing the number of reviewers and the number of members of the editorial board from the African continent. And then finally, the recognition of work from Africa and African biometeorologists. Now, This could be in part through awards, through grants, but it's also through making sure that the African work that's being conducted is being mentioned in review papers, is being cited appropriately in empirical research, and that it is not being ignored. And that is a task for the editorial boards, for reviewers, and for authors themselves, to make sure that they're up to date and aware of African research, and that they're not writing off the African continent as an area that is not being touched in terms of particular subthemes of biometeorology or particular areas of research, making sure that they're up to date and that they know the work that is being done and that they're giving it due recognition. So to conclude, as I've mentioned a few times throughout this talk, it is very concerning that only 3.4% of the papers in the International Journal of Biometeorology as of the 12th of June 2020 were on or of the African continent. The majority of the 135 papers that do focus on African biometeorology are on animal biometeorology, a really exciting area of research and something we certainly want to encourage. But of course, there's space for a lot more work to be done in tourism biometeorology, health biometeorology, thermal comfort and stress, plant diversity and plant distribution. The greatest proportion of studies to date are from Nigeria, although there are an increasing number of studies from other African countries. That said, there are many African countries where only 1 or 2 studies have been conducted, and so there's a lot more space for representativity across the African continent. Of the papers that have been published, 66% include at least one African author, but only 15 of the African countries are represented in this authorship. And so again, there's a lot more space for representativity to be improved. We need to encourage greater engagement from and representation of the African continent. And the best way for us to achieve that is through each one of us to make our contributions. If we think we are doing research in biometeorology, then find out what biometeorology is and perhaps submit your work to the International Journal of Biometeorology. Join the International Society of Biometeorology, attend the congresses, and encourage people that you know to do the same. So in light of this, I finished my talk with a couple of links to the International Journal of Biometeorology, one of the Springer journals, to the International Society of Biometeorology, which has special rates particularly for African countries and the least economically developed regions. And then for those of you who are interested for greater detail, the paper that I've been talking to throughout this talk, The Perspectives on Biometeorological Research in the African Continent. Thank you very much to Africa in Science for giving me this platform to talk through this paper and to encourage biometeorologists across the African continent to get more involved. Thank you.